Chapter 8.
The Morollers. Dixie Dog sped up a steep hill. Behind him, a rabid pack of zombie-like figures were giving chase. And despite the incline, their gurgling sounds appeared to be getting increasingly closer. I should have headed west, Dixie groaned to himself. He had found himself in one of those situations where one had to be careful of what they wished for. Amazing. Just a little while ago in Kinkankerville, he had been pining about how dull life was. But now, he couldn't stop thinking about what his philosophy teacher had once told him. If you ever do get what you've always wished, you may actually find yourself realizing that you are not what you think you were been made up of all along. Several hours ago, Dixie had suddenly appeared somewhere on the other side of the giant wave rock walls of what he guessed had to have been Anakaland. He remembered having strange dreams, or were they dreams? Dreams about being in free fall practically forever. Then he remembered walking into this blue glowing Aztec pyramid thing in the clouds. And the next thing he remembered were more unpleasant dreams before he woke up on a bed of ferns. And then this. He had stumbled onto these humanoid creatures and immediately turned tail and fled into a trail behind a thick cluster of pine trees. As he kept running away from the hideous things, he was thinking about how naive he had been to think this was going to be a great adventure. Yes, for the longest time, all Dixie ever did was whine about how boring life was, back home in the boring realms. What a fool. Just a few years ago, he would go off on these random soliloquies about how, quote-unquote, we could really make reality more exciting for us all, and we won't feel so dull in our comfortable oblivion. And he would often proselytize to his friends to stop living such boring lives. If only we would dare to chase our dreams, he would sometimes scream randomly to crowds of bystanders. When he was a teenager, Dixie would often preach these ideas while mounting random statues or other monuments by the Torturia Plaza Square for fun. He really was a bit of a twit. He liked to do this not because he wanted to help the world, but because he liked to pretend he was some great avatar prophet trying to enlighten the crowds with his deep ideas, regardless of whether the crowd really appreciated it or not. But Dixie didn't care. He loved pretending to be some sort of pseudo-motivational speaker to the masses, sharing these clairvoyant diatribes of enlightenment to all within earshot, that they may ponder throughout the day, as if nobody had ever occurred these ideas to themselves before. More than a few people had thought him nuts. When he'd do stuff like this, occasionally a passerby would slow down from their wall-pulling activities and look up at Dixie as he sat perched on a statue in the middle of Newton Square by City Hall. Such bystanders would stare for a few seconds without replying, and then walk away slowly, while staring at the ground in silent thought, as if the seeds of wisdom had been planted. Moments like that made Dixie feel like a mystic. Aside from hanging out with the Babayan brothers and setting up quote-unquote celery generals, this used to be his favorite pastime. And to think I've craved high adventure all my life, he thought as he sprinted away from these chasing zombie things behind him. But he had never counted on being where he was at now. Never imagined himself one bit the adventurer. Not with that big squat nose of his, blocky build, and his gigantic goofy-looking face that trolls on the internet claimed was the size of a witch doctor's mask. Dixie just didn't feel like the proverbial action hero. And yet, here he was. His face was sweating as he heard the wails of the creatures following him through the trails. Terror alone was driving him to continue running. If this quest to save the world from various floodgates of portals should have been taken seriously, it appeared he was doing a piss-poor job of trying to resolve the matter. Not once did you think of the consequence of your actions, he cursed to himself. The howls were getting louder. Oh, stop it, he cried out loud. Beating yourself now isn't helping. Stay calm, or at least try to, and shut up. came the freakish cries of the pursuing creatures from behind. They got even louder. Dixie was scared, but not ultimately feeling defeated just yet. He remembered the strange energy ball he absorbed, and he still felt like his limbs could move exceedingly fast. Rounding a sharp corner on the trail, Dixie jumped down a ravine full of thick plant life to get out of the way of the zombies. Perhaps they would be too stupid to follow. A few yards below a series of ferns, the steep ground became extremely slippery, and Dixie slid down off a cliff and into a pile of dead leaves below. The sounds of the zombie beasts became fainter. Dixie closed his eyes and paused to catch his breath. He tried once again to recollect everything that had happened. All right, once again, what the hell happened? He asked, gathering his wits. He remembered his adventure in the Great Gravity Door. For all its LSD sensations, he was pretty sure it had not been a dream. But if it wasn't, then what had happened? Might have been a limbo world, Dixie reasoned. He remembered something he read about the Great Gravity Door in esoteric myths. Damn, if only he had brought that book to read while he had gone into the bathroom. He always brought entertainment with him. What bad timing for a first. Now I'm in an alien land without a guide, he lamented. The voice statue thingy had given him clues about Anakaland. Then he remembered the notes in his wallet. That's right, he cried. The Oracle thing gave me a buttload of facts about what was going on, or I'm really screwed. Fumbling through his wallet, he found the notes with all the dictations he took while he had, quote-unquote, spoken to the statue voice. Dixie studied the notes for a while. Some of them were still intact and legible. Perhaps 20 minutes had gone by, and although everything about the portals and the end of the world and Anakaland and the Hollow Earth was starting to come back to him, he still had no definitive idea of what to do next. Dixie got up and brushed himself off. He headed towards an opening in the trees ahead and resembled something of a lost soul wandering an ancient forest. At least here in the woods, there was something that resembled another little trail. But he clearly was lost now. Where did he go wrong? As he walked, he tried to recollect the other dreams he had had before he had found himself here. Maybe there was something clairvoyant about them as well. In his first dream, he remembered he had discovered a tunnel by the outskirts of Kankankerville, which seemed to lead into a hollow earth, where everything looked like it did above ground. The sky was still blue, and the people in this hollow earth looked exactly like the citizens of his home city above the surface. Only everything was moving twice as fast, as if the fabric of reality was being hit by a fast-forward button. Then he found another tunnel that led to another hollow earth identical to the other one, except that everything increased in speed twice as fast again. This went on several more times until the world around them was moving so fast that it appeared as if turtles on the ground were practically sprinting. A word came to his mind at the end of the dream.
Time dilation.
In the next part of the dream, he found himself in a 3-decker building somewhere in a sketchy neighborhood with an entire block of tennis courts occupying one side of the street. In the dream, he was running a cat breeding company, and his top breeding female cat was this beautiful orange tabby cat with long blonde supermodel hair on her scalp and a jean jacket that fastened nicely to her upper cat body. As he was showing her off to a prospective customer on the porch of his building, a procession of skinny pro wrestlers with shaved heads, goatees, and black wrestling trunks paraded down the street practicing shuffle punching drills. They were holding up life-size cardboard cutouts of an ancient grappler his grandfather had been a huge fan of, former champion wrestler Bill Goldberg. The skinny wrestlers were swaying the cutouts around like banners as they hummed a mournful tune while they paraded past Dixie. He remembered then something about a street mime named Tojo Jolowowski, who was dressed like a character from the movie Clockwork Orange, and he came out of nowhere and pretended he was trapped in a box while a live marching band made their way past him. Well, that was stupid, Dixie said to himself as he fought through a nest of branches in the way of his path. Nothing profound about that last part. In retrospect, maybe they were just more of his typical stupid dreams. But what about the other dreams, he wondered to himself. The tower. And the great gravity door was still not a dream, he insisted, as he cautiously followed the trail. It was too real. Dixie decided to mentally retrace every step he had taken since he had woken up. Well, why not? I need to strategize, he said to himself while he just sat there on a leaf pile. He recollected everything he could think of that had happened since he woke up here in this place, starting with waking by the ferns. Nothing significant there, except for the fact that he had woken up along the edge of the wild by the slope south of what he had thought was Mount Muhadeo, but not one area looked like the barren moonscape that was supposed to be Anakaland. Nothing around here resembled that. As he looked around, Dixie remembered first seeing an array of vast gardens with plenty of vegetation and a purple-pink twilight sky above him. It took Dixie a while to gather his wits and realize this place looked more like something out of the urban legends than what the local Weather Channel had indoctrinated him with. Well, upon finally realizing he couldn't just relax there forever, Dixie remembered following a trail that looked like the most logical path out of one of his gardens. What else could he have done? Then he remembered his next decision and closed his eyes in frustration. Instead of making sure he was going west towards the general direction of a place like Kirkertown to get supplies, Dixie unwittingly started heading east through a narrow trail that was wedged in between a thick growth of protruding vines by the edge of the garden he was standing in. Yup, that's definitely where I screwed up, he reminded himself. Well, maybe not. It seemed like a logical route at the time. Dixie had followed the trail until it burrowed through a maze of vines that were as tall as cornstalks growing all around him. He wandered uneasily through the tall vines for an hour until he reached a meadow on these highlands that gave him a view of the entire landscape around him. In the distance, he remembered how he could clearly see the large mountain of Muhadeo directly to what he thought was east of him. But after getting distracted by an ancient warship to the distant northwest that had inexplicably run aground, Dixie decided to follow a series of flat fields he found between some barren rolling hills along the western edge of the mountain. Don't be so hard on yourself, Dixie comforted himself. Except for those zombies, it really was a nice trail. Besides, you wouldn't have ever stumbled onto that tower and the food supplies. The tower! He had followed the greenway of tall grass for 2 hours until it discontinued at a dead end encircled by hills all around him. Having no other option, Dixie had started climbing the foremost hill directly in front of him, lamenting the fact that he had to do it and that his cardio was pretty bad as well. It was on that hill, however, where he first encountered the same performance-enhancing, quote-unquote, popcorn bags full of berries, unbeknownst to him, that Chili Sue had later discovered. He was just as reckless as her. Putting a whole pile of them into his mouth, Dixie found his energy levels going up, as if he had drunk fire cider and had taken a shot of PCP at the same time. Luckily for him, this stuff wasn't deadly in the long run, as he eventually found out. It was good that he found these edibles, though. The fool had not brought anything with him on this journey. Once he had reached the top of the hill, Dixie had been treated to a commanding view of the vast region up ahead to the north, and it didn't look easy to hike through. But that's when he saw it. Across a dark forest with scattered meadows and a few hills in between, and beyond a gigantic valley further ahead, Dixie saw a strangely shaped golden tower in the far horizon. It was tiny and barely visible, perhaps 60 miles away, perhaps further. But he was on a very high hill. It was most peculiar in design. He wasn't sure, but silhouetted against the artificial dusk skylight behind it, the tower almost looked like a shark fin. Right after he had descended towards the nearest meadow was when he had slammed into them. Those vicious, nasty-looking creatures. They had been grazing near the far edge of the meadow by some bushes. Neither of them had noticed each other. That was, until Dixie let out a loud yelp, and then a fart, and ran. And soon they gave chase. There were maybe about 15 of them, and he tried to lose them through a few other hills, and then through a maze of trails in this dark forest. That was the last 20 minutes of his life before he slipped down this ravine and onto a pile of leaves. Feel better? He asked himself as he got up, and he brushed the leaves off his sleeves. Now you know. As if you didn't know, you dope. Head towards the tower. Dixie walked through more meadows and scaled a few more hills, never bumping into the pack of zombies along the way. At the top of the nearest hill, he was happy to notice that he seemed to be going in the right direction. The tower was far away, but at least just a little bit closer than before. Suddenly, on top of a high meadow, Dixie saw the strangest thing. A flock of shapes that legit looked like long tree trunks flapping their branches like wings as they flew over him. They were high enough in the sky to not pose any danger, but nevertheless, Dixie slammed himself face first to the ground in fear. When he looked up again, they were gone. Dixie studied the shape of the tower again. It had been clearly built by some sort of intelligent life. And if there was anybody in this place, they were likely to dwell over there. Without any further consideration for calculating more food supplies, warm clothes, or even a trail to backtrack so he wouldn't get lost, he pulled a Don Quixote and ran aimlessly through the dark wood in the direction of the tower. It was here in these woods that Dixie met his next official misadventure in this bewildering twilight world of Anakaland. Hell, even esoteric myths painted it pretty like this. So then what's up with the mountain anyways, Dixie reasoned. If I really need to head home, I'll just go towards that direction, just like the note says. It was a good thing he had written this stuff down. Or at least whatever he had kept, and hadn't been smeared in his butt pocket. It did make him, though, feel much more secure than nothing. But then, as he strolled underneath a section of reddish-brown fir trees, he smacked right into another pack of those undead creatures that were chasing him before. They had appeared from out of nowhere while he stared at his shuffling feet and was counting his footsteps for something to do. At first, they were just as stunned by him as he of them, and so he momentarily got a closer look at them. They may not have been technically zombies, but they sure resembled them. They were like leprous, furry, primitive cousins of his own species. There were 5 of them in front of him, and they looked mean enough, and with their dark purple-blue skin and glowing green-blue eyes, they were the last thing Dixie was hoping he'd bump into around here. He prayed they were not the so-called zombies the tales spoke of that would surround their prey and recite the Pledge of Allegiance, or some other ancient soliloquy in their horrible guttural language and drive their victims mad with insanity. Until they fall over in exhaustion and turn into a sleepwalker, or they do it themselves, Dixie thought with a panic. Once again, he bolted like a horse that had just been kicked by a size 15 heel. Luckily, thanks to the combination of the gummy fruit stuff and his newly found ability of grand velocity he had acquired from absorbing that energy ball, he was able to get an exquisitely good head start on them. But unfortunately, as he ran out of the woods, he ran into another crowd of them about a half a mile away. They were sitting in a meadow, grazing by some dandelions and picking dirt off each other like a pack of silverback gorillas when they saw Dixie. Sprinting out of the trees, he came. And as soon as they spotted him, they let out a loud collective wail and gave chase. Dixie never stopped to look back. Like one of those terrible zombie movies where victims are running for their lives in the streets of a city taken over by a plague, Dixie's silhouette could be seen against the unending twilight sky as he sprinted to the top of a hill, followed by this motley crew close behind. The adrenaline was kicking in, and Dixie was wondering how much longer he could go on like this when his brain started to think of ways to outwit them. He tried to contemplate what his older brother Dunny told him to do if he ever got chased by zombies. Dixie Dog was a big fan of horror movies, and consequently, it gave him a useless arsenal of knowledge for what to do if any number of fictitious outbreaks, alien invasions, or rampages were to ever occur in society. But it was through this useless collection of survival facts that Dixie learned from an early age to A. Make sure the Dog family invested in a large Jeep with high suspension so that the vehicle could plow over hordes of the infected, undead, or just plain mutated forms of human beings if they ever found themselves in a city square while retreating from such an apocalypse. B. Always keep a shotgun in the trunk of the vehicle and at least a month's supply of canned food, although trying to keep this rule intact got the Dog brothers in trouble a lot of times. C. Make note that if you're trying to fight any monsters, don't ever let yourself get cornered or trapped in a building without a secret exit. D. If you ever fight a ghost, note that shadowboxing doesn't actually accomplish anything. But take care because they reportedly can still chairs or other projectiles right at you. These were certainly useful survival tips to consider, but in this case, it all seemed pretty irrelevant. Why didn't he ever learn any real useful survival tips, or taken classes in martial arts instead of always educating himself through comic books? He tried to think of any other tips his older brother might have passed on to him. All that came to him was a flashback when Dunny tried to unsuccessfully start a website he figured would go viral sooner or later. www.zombieapocalypsebuddysystemhelp.com. It never took off the way he had hoped. I wonder if you can go to jail for friendly fire during a zombie apocalypse if you accidentally shoot a human being that just happens to be ugly, he wondered, as he leaped through a thicket of rhododendron bushes. He could hear the wails getting further away, but it seemed that yet another pack had heard the wailing and was now joining in the pursuit. New wails could be heard in the woods to his left. Ah, creeping crap on a stick, he thought. The woods are infested with these things. What was that other thing Dunny said about zombies? Let's see. He rummaged through his mind more frantically. Pick a meeting place to regroup in case zombies invade? No good. Identify emergency contacts? Great, but no good. Dixie's heart was racing. He wondered how long he could keep up this pace. Ahead of him was an especially steep hill. Make a list of local contacts like the police and a professional zombie response team. Completely useless. Thanks, Dunny. The thing was, there was no way to prove these creatures were actually zombies. Nevertheless, the pursuers relentlessly stalked up the hill and were practically right behind him now. Identify an out-of-state contact that you can call during an emergency so everyone knows you're okay. Plan your evacuation route. His brain was busting for an idea. Isolate and quarantine these bastards. That's it! Dixie would have completely gassed out by now had it not been for the adrenaline from the gummies. Still, he would have given in to despair if he had not stumbled onto a giant field ahead of him that had cratered pits throughout the field. It was as if the place had just gotten bombed. It was almost too good to be true. If he could just lure them straight into a pit while summoning up enough strength to leap over it, perhaps he could get a pile of these monstrosities to fall into the gorges. He didn't understand the mathematical calculations needed to successfully reckon leaping over one of these pits, but he was running out of options. The first two attempts to try to trap the creatures in this fashion were aborted. At the last moment, Dixie chickened out and simply ran around the edge of the pit, and the zombies easily followed suit. But then, something totally random happened. Ahead of him, about 50 feet away, was a giant net on the ground covering about an acre of field. It was right underneath the branches of some very large deciduous tree along the other end of the field, and as he got closer, he could see a sign attached to one of these tree trunks ahead. It appeared to read, "Trap in case of Morollers," and it was curiously written in his own language, along with other indecipherable characters that suggested an alien language. And it had a symbol that looked like an arrow pointing to a rope next to it. it could have been a big ruse. But considering the circumstances, if this crap didn't work, Dixie could always try his luck with the pit. Straight ahead, there were a few more of them. What are the odds? He pondered himself with a smile. If this wasn't a dream, this sure felt like it, aside from the heavy breathing and his complete physical exhaustion. He didn't know who had graciously set up such a trap, but he vowed that if he ever met its maker, that he would pat them on the back and shake their hand. Running straight towards the netted trap, Dixie, with one last effort, sprinted as fast as he could to give him clearing from his pursuers. He had crossed midway through the net when the trap sprung, suddenly and unexpectedly. Wow, how could he not have noticed the folly of his own plan? A rush of coarse laughter resonated from the rapid pursuers behind him, as if they were in on the joke and were just waiting for this moment to arrive. Perhaps zombies were way more resourceful than anybody had given them credit for. But instead of pulling down the baited net and mauling the hell out of Dixie before eating him, they just ran past right below like a pack of runners and continued to laugh at his expense. Dixie was crushed, being humiliated and outwitted by a trap in the middle of nowhere was embarrassing enough. But being mocked for your stupidity by zombies who are supposed to be hundreds of times dumber than you was truly mortifying. But at least he was alive, though he was too wretched to appreciate that right now. Dixie instinctively reached for his magical caratless phone thingy, hoping the mysterious speaker might conveniently reach out to him right then and there. Nothing. After staring at it blankly and at the trees in front of him, Dixie took a deep breath and realized he better do something quick. 10 minutes went by, and soon the zombies came back. But they got bored and simply left him in the trap. Apparently, after a few pathetic jumps, they made no further effort to get him down and soon left him to his own humiliation. This was all too weird and unexpected. Were they just sadistic and playing mind games with him? After 15 minutes of waiting for something, Dixie's mind started relaxing a bit again. He wondered what it must be like to be one of these creatures. Would I rather look like a zombie but be able to retain my cognitive motor skills? Or would I rather just look beautiful and be like a zombie? Thoughts like this came to his mind. But after shaking off the cobwebs of humiliation, he started reasoning better. Well, if those mutants didn't set this trap up, then somebody else should be here lurking nearby, he figured. That's probably bad. But either way, perhaps if I swing this thing a bit... Dixie did not know it properly, but what he imagined as a solution for his predicament was to create a giant pendulum. By swinging around off the branch he was caught under, Dixie was going to swing the branch over to safety. Perhaps he could grab the side of the trunk of a nearby tree. If those rabid zombies were around, there was no sight or smell of them anywhere. Dixie caused the trap to swing by simply rocking his arms as far back as he could and then rock them hard in the other direction to create a bit of angular momentum. In a smooth conjunction involving a hip jerk, a neck thrust, and one more arm swinging all at the same time, he was able to create a greater pendulum motion. Like pumping on a swing set, the higher he rocked, the greater the net swung towards a nearby branch. Dixie knew this could get nasty if the zombies were lying in wait for him to break free of the trap. But maybe he was wrong about them. After all, how smart could a pack of wild so-called zombies be? I mean, they seem to be dumb enough to just let me stay in the trap instead of at least attempt a few pathetic jumps to pull me down, he said to himself. Then again, maybe Dixie was the one that was so dumb that they actually had laughed at him as they let him hang there and rot in his fate. As he kept swinging, Dixie noticed something. High up, on one of the other trees, was a bundle of rope that had been wrapped up like a sleeping bag and lightly tied to the top of a nearby branch. After a few swings towards the direction of the thing, he had no doubt that it had to be a rope ladder graciously devised for his convenience. Upon inspecting the tree trunk on the other side of this pendulum motion, he noticed another note. underneath an overhanging branch attached to it by means of an impaled knife. It took about 12 swings or so for Dixie to grab the knife while keeping the note, another 7 to hold on to the rope bundle and unravel it so it morphed into a ladder, and finally another 4 to actually grab onto the rope ladder and not let go. From there, Dixie cut through the trapping without plummeting 12 feet into the hard ground below. A quick attempt to mount the ladder caused him to endure a collision with a nearby tree that left him dizzy, but he held on to it like a beat-up boxer. An unsteady climb down the ladder, and then touchdown! Dixie had never felt so relieved and angry at the same time. If this trap had been devised for his welcome, he never got a chance to find out. When he finally opened up the note, there was nothing there. It was all so cruel. Probably some previous trapper's sadistic idea of a joke, muttered Dixie. Who the hell would do that to a person? Surely not these zombies. I doubt they're even good with ropes. But at least it gave him a sense of perspective. I suppose I should be happy I'm alive, but this day just keeps getting stupider, he muttered. But he meant this as a jab to his own boneheadedness. After all, he was the one who had made an ass of himself in front of a pack of undead zombies that probably figured he was too pathetic to bother killing. At least now he had a knife.